All right, welcome everyone who's joined us today here. How many people do we have? We are still waiting for some to show up, so maybe wait a little while. In the meantime, let me welcome you to our very first episode of the webinar series that we're just starting here at Protaigé. The webinar series is called Weeks to Hours Transformation Series. And this session will establish the foundational premise basically for the entire series. The content operations problems aren't really tool problems, they're workflow and business process problems. So today's topic, brand voice, is the most universal, probably the one that is immediately recognizable by all AI teams, content teams out there. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right. Here's a story. Imagine you hire a ghostwriter and she's incredible. She produces a polished 1,000-word article in 3 minutes flat. But she's never actually read a single thing that your company has published, right? She doesn't really know what your industry is and any quirks that your brand uses that make your brand sound like your brand. She's fast, so you hand her the assignment anyway. And the draft comes back in minutes. It's fine. It's grammatically correct and facts are right, but it sounds nothing like you. It could belong to anyone in your space. And so what happens is you spend 45 minutes making it sound like you. Next week, same thing happens, same ghostwriter, same result, still fast, still generic, still 45 minutes fixing it on your end. So here's the thing. She never learns because you never taught her. You never showed her what your brand sounds like, what your brand stands for. You just keep handing her assignments over and over and cleaning up after her. So I think you guessed it. That ghostwriter in the story is what most of us are doing with AI right now. Hi, I'm Wawa. I co-run Protaigé, where we help teams solve exactly this problem and other content ops problems like this. Today, we'll talk about why it happens and where the real fix lives. So hopefully by the end of this session, you'll see AI content differently as an input problem that you can solve upstream before a single word is generated. Stay until the end. I'll show you one number that kind of makes you rethink everything about brand voice. All right, let's start with what we all have in common, I think. Everyone in this room probably made the same bet. I bet you made the same bet. We all invested in AI to produce more, to produce faster, and to do it without really growing our team. So the result is that on the surface, everything worked. We achieved these goals. The volume went up. The drafts that took a day now take minutes. And you're definitely not alone there. 85% of marketers use AI writing tools. 80% of content teams use AI for drafts. This isn't early adopter territory anymore. This is table stakes. It's the new default that we're all in. And you probably achieved the more volume part. But here's what's also probably happened. I think you'll recognize this from your experience that the drafts come back fast, but they don't quite sound correct and they sound generic instead, interchangeable. So what happens is your audience can't really tell the difference between you, your content, and your competitors. And it's a cycle, right? Because what happens is AI generates and your team edits. It rewrites, it makes each piece sound like you. Some teams have added new roles, like prompt engineers, content engineers. Others have adopted smart systems, either style guides that are baked into prompts or they have added some tone instructions, maybe They copy the brand guidelines in every time they need to generate something. And those are all smart workarounds. I'm not going to tell you they are completely wasted, but instead I'm going to ask, is it working? And is the problem getting any better? Because here's what I actually think is happening. And the numbers tell a very specific story. So in 2024, Capterra asked marketers, are you spending less time on content after having adopted AI? And 49% said no, same time or even more once editing is factored in, which is astonishing, really. And half the teams using AI to save time aren't really saving time. McKinsey found that 30 to 40% of AI time that is allegedly saved gets consumed by review and voice alignment. HubSpot claims that 60% marketers say AI output needs significant oversight. We adopted AI to go faster and then built an editing layer to slow it back down. So that's the editing treadmill, basically running constantly and getting nowhere all the time. So now here's the important number that I mentioned earlier at the beginning. Imagine a small team, content team, produces on average 10 AI pieces a week. That's reasonable. And with the 45 minutes spent on average on editing each of that piece, that is 7.5 hours a week. So that's a full workday essentially. Every week spent on editing. Over a year, that's 390 hours. That's the equivalent of 10 weeks of full-time work. And that is time spent not creating, not strategizing, just editing. And the same editing cycle gets repeated over and over. So it's a system that never gets better. What would you do? What would your team do with those 390 hours that you could reclaim potentially? And this is more than just an efficiency problem because brand inconsistency costs real money. It costs 10 to 20% of annual revenue. And consistent brands grow 2.4 times faster than those that don't have brand consistency. Moreover, 81% of consumers need to trust a brand before buying. Every off-brand piece basically erodes trust. And the longer you scale AI without fixing this, the harder it gets. So when you double output without governance, without properly embedding quality controls, that quality drops by 30 to 50%, as research shows. And it only compounds the more you use it, right? So again, this is very much a revenue problem and not necessarily a purely efficiency one. And that gets worse and worse every week. What most teams haven't seen yet is that the problem lives somewhere that they are not looking. So AI writes generic content for one reason, because nobody told it to do anything else. Without your vocabulary, without the rhythm patterns that you use for AI, for your own content, AI defaults to the most generic possible output, the statistically relevant one. So it's like asking a brilliant stranger to do your job without telling them about your company. Look at those numbers. 70 to 90% of organizations have brand guidelines, and only 25 to 35 actually enforce them and use consistently. But perhaps most interestingly, only 20% of organizations have guidelines detailed enough for AI's use. Most of you probably have guidelines, but they weren't built for AI. They were built in the pre-AI era. And so that's the gap. Your voice lives as tribal knowledge in the head of 2 or 3 senior writers. And that worked perfectly fine when humans wrote everything. Not when AI produces all the content or 10 times the content, which is the case now. Robert Rose, Content Marketing Institute's co-founder, said AI doesn't have a brand voice problem. You have a brand voice documentation problem. So when you fix the input, what happens really is that the output fixes itself. And there are usually two strategies that get adopted out there. One is the prompt-based one, and prompts are turn-by-turn directions to one destination. Because when you have 50 people, you have 50 versions of your voice, right? And the other approach is brand encoding, which is essentially about programming the GPS for every trip that you take your audience on with your content. So this one is, on the other hand, persistent, and it's shared across all the team, and it compounds over time. William Edward Deming was a business theorist, a consultant. Some say that he's the father of modern lean manufacturing. And he famously said, you can't inspect quality into a product. So what Deming identified at the time was that factories added inspectors at the end of the production line. And it never worked, because quality has to be built into the inputs, into the systems and standards that are used. And content operations really is learning this whole thing right now. Editing AI for brand voice is end of the line thinking, where the inspection is happening at the end of the content production cycle. As in manufacturing, it's expensive, it's inconsistent, and it doesn't scale. What you need to think about is how to fix it upstream, not downstream. So what exactly changes when you move brand voice from editing to the input layer? Teams without brand voice encoding spend roughly 40% of their workflow on post-AI editing. Teams that have branded coding spend 15 to 20%. That's half the burden of the ones that don't use branded coding, half or more. So those 390 hours I shared before suddenly shrink to half that, so to under 200. Right. So the time that you reclaim in this way can go back to strategy, to creative, to distribution, you name it. But basically work that really impacts and differentiates your brand. Consistency needs to become a system instead of being a bottleneck that it is oftentimes. So think about how McDonald's has 40,000 restaurants over 100 plus countries. It's an immense scale that's achieved not through talent. McDonald's scaled through codified operations manuals, basically. And your brand guidelines need to work in the same way. Encoded knowledge needs to be fed into every tool and team member's head and can be drawn from automatically. This compounds as you scale those operations. So the encoded voice really becomes the baseline. And the practical impact is that imagine new hires that you onboard much faster, or partners like your agencies and freelancers that can match your brand voice almost instantly. So it's all living in a system that gets better over time and that everybody can share and reuse. Doug Kessler, co-founder of Velocity Partners, calls the phenomenon we're discussing today the Great Bayesianing, which basically means all content converges toward bland and forgettable middle. Joe Polizzi, another co-founder of the Content Marketing Institute, calls voice the last moat. What you really need to do is encode your voice to avoid the beige. How do you actually encode your brand for AI? There are two valid approaches. One is do it yourself, the other is done for you. So the do it yourself path requires you to first audit your brand voice docs for AI readiness. That's some pre-work that you need to do upfront, because your guidelines probably stop at stuff like adjectives: confident, approachable, innovative, and so on. Whereas AI ready content needs to go a little bit deeper, and it needs to contain vocabulary patterns, sentence structures, audience assumptions, maybe some phrases to avoid, how you calibrate your tone by content type. So once that's done, a do it yourself system requires you to restructure, to configure, and to govern. So there's quite a substantial maintenance cost there, but it works. It just takes time. Path number 2 is done for you when you ingest your existing documentation to an AI like Protaigé or any other AI tool of your choice. That means all of it: guidelines, tone of voice, personas, visual identity, even. And the AI encodes it into an AI ready foundation that's applied across every piece of content. Basically, you will find in systems like this multiple AI agents that enforce consistency at every stage of the creative process. Both of these paths, the do it yourself and done for you, start from the same insight that your guidelines have, and they just need to be restructured for AI. If you want to go into one of these paths, then I encourage you to use these QR codes. We're going to share them in the presentation distributed after this webinar as links. The do-it-yourself resource is a do-it-yourself brand voice setup document. It's essentially a guide if you want to build the whole system yourself. You can clone it into your AI project, and it works with any AI tool, any LLM of your choosing. For the done for you path, we are offering a free consultation call, which is essentially a 30-minute call where we walk through your workflow to find where your voice gets diluted and where potential rework compounds, and we identify those gaps. Here's the before and after. It used to be that draft took 3 minutes, and then 45 minutes was spent making those drafts sound like you. Whereas the after gives you drafts that land 80% on brand, and then your team only spends like 10 minutes reviewing it, maybe adding some nuance, some more context, and it's ready to publish. Before, voice used to live in 2 senior writers' heads, and when they went on holiday, quality dropped. After, voice is encoded, and every person, every tool has the same foundation. It's a reusable system. And by way of simple calculation, we found that 390 hours a year was spent on repetitive editing that never compounds. And that time after implementing a system can be reclaimed to be spent on strategy, creative, distribution. So basically, work that moves the needle for your brand. Here are 3 simple things that you can do anytime to fix this. One is audit your voice, your brand voice. Take like 10 AI pieces and score them against your brand guidelines, or maybe the piece you're about to publish. Look for consistent gaps and see what's missing from the AI's input. Number 2, document what's in your head and your writer's head. Get your whole content team together for like an hour, do a workshop, and find out what are the words that the team would never use, the structures that they feel are right or wrong, and any tone shifts, for example, they would apply for different content types. Write it all down, and then proceed to 3, which is essentially testing it, testing the system. Use AI to prompt it for a topic, and then do the same with and without brand context and compare. You'll see the difference. So to reiterate, we all want to scale content with AI. Brand voice can't be something we fix after the draft is done. So you need to think what would happen if brand was the foundation, the infrastructure that everything builds on. We can audit what's in our heads. We can encode our brand for AI, turn those guidelines to an AI usable format. And essentially, the impact is we turn brand consistency from a bottleneck that it is now into a system that's built for AI. If you remember that Ghostwriter, I began my talk with the one who was incredibly fast but never learned. She's still waiting, and she just needs you to finally show her what your brand sounds like. So remember, your output problem is really an input problem at heart. Fix the input, and the output fixes itself. All right, so you've seen the problem, the cause, the fix. So what does this look like for you? We built here a path you can follow, and every step is free. It's all free resources accompanying this webinar. Starting with the symptoms, there's a free AI fingerprint checker that we prepared. It basically lets you find AI telltales in your content. The diagnose one, the brand voice gap diagnostic, lets you identify the root cause and what your guidelines are missing. You can encode your brand using our own Protaigé's brand helix. It's a tool that lets you format your brand guidelines in an AI-ready format. And when you're ready to fix it, either do it yourself with the brand voice setup document or book a consultation. And let me thank you for hanging on with me for this entire presentation. Now let's start the questions and answers. All right, I see a lot of chat activity while I was gone. Alice is asking, how long does it take to encode a brand voice? The do-it-yourself path is quite substantial in terms of time investment. And so depending on how familiar you are with the ways that AI projects work, whether it's something more or less sophisticated, you basically need to set it up. There are some fields that you have to pre-fill with your brand voice. And yeah, that's a system that once done, it's going to scale. However, you will still need to be mindful of the maintenance cost that is built into a system like that. The done for you path is much simpler because the AI platforms out there now let you do this instantly. Use the brand guideline documents that you have ready, or you can generate one with our brand helix. And it's as simple as uploading a file and waiting for AI to process it. So really instantaneous. Ollie is asking, what's the difference between brand encoding and just like really good prompts? Oh yeah, good one. So I'd say prompts are one-offs. Prompts get you as far as one or maybe a couple content outputs, but that's it. And you have to bear in mind that my prompt is my prompt, your prompt is going to be something different, even if shared within the same team. This quickly will turn into a hydra that has multiple heads, and no one really knows where the original is anymore, what the original is supposed to be. You're not necessarily using the same source of truth across prompts. If you're thinking about marketing and how marketing campaigns are built, they need consistency across content assets. So if you're having a chat thread and another thread, and in both you're producing separate assets for the campaign, these don't talk to each other, so you lose that. Whereas brand encoding really gets around all of those issues. You can get much larger context windows when you use brand encoding systems that under the hood use just APIs to talk to LLMs directly. Can the brand voice be changed later once it's encoded? Yeah, of course. It's a good question. You would think it's set in stone and won't change anymore once it's set up, but it's all dynamic, and it's supposed to be, because your brand is a living thing, and it evolves over time. It evolves with your audiences, just as the market evolves. You need to be a brand that also changes the way how it communicates to your audiences. All right, I see we have more questions, but we're already 2 minutes over time. And I think this is a proper time to wrap things up here. So thank you very much for participations. You can send the rest of the questions over to our team. We'll be happy to answer them all. Thank you so much for being here with me. My name is Vava, and stay tuned for more episodes in this series, which are going to be delivered by my colleagues and myself too. So, next episode, you'll be joining Chrissy, my co founder, who's going to talk about briefs, marketing briefs, and what is the proper way to use them and to create them. All right. Thank you all. See you next time. Bye.